It's been a year since former cricketer turned politician Imran Khan became Pakistan's prime minister. Khan's campaign slogan was Naya Pakistan, or New Pakistan, a reflection of his promises to turn the country's economy around and end corruption. But the first year of his premiership hasn't gone as smoothly as he may have hoped or even expected, especially in terms of the economy. The Pakistani rupee has lost 35% of its value during his time in office. Khan's critics call him the prime minister of the U-turns, as he has been forced to go back on many of his campaign pledges in an attempt to rescue the situation. But have any of these U-turns had a positive impact on the country? In terms of foreign affairs, Pakistan is closer than ever to its neighbor China, but relations with its other neighbor, India, are at a new low. Are these two nuclear countries at risk of another major conflict or war? I'm Mohammed Jamjoom in Islamabad. Prime Minister Khan recently marked 1 year in office. I sat down with him and discussed his government's controversies as well as Pakistan's foreign and domestic policies. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan talked. You'll soon be at the UNGA in New York. You'll be making your debut there as the Prime Minister of Pakistan. What message do you hope to impart to the international community from there?
Well, under normal circumstances, I would have talked about climate change. Pakistan is one of the few countries that is most vulnerable to climate change. I would have spoken at length on that. And secondly, about Islam, Islamophobia, the way Muslims suffer from Islamophobia, especially living in Western countries. And of course in India, Islamophobia in India right now. Muslims are subjected to persecution. But because of what is happening in Kashmir, I would be mainly talking about the Kashmir situation.
At the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, he made remarks saying that he believed that because of what India was doing in Kashmir, that India and Pakistan could be led into an accidental war. Do you believe this is a possibility?
Absolutely. What is happening is that India is more or less conducting a genocide. The sort of racial attacks on a population, I don't think it's been witnessed since Nazi Germany. What is happening is the Indian version of a final solution for the Muslims of Kashmir. So 8 million Muslims in Kashmir are under siege for almost now 6 weeks. And why this can become a flashpoint between India and Pakistan, because what we know already India is trying to do is to divert attention from their illegal annexation and their impending genocide on Kashmir. They are taking the attention away by blaming Pakistan for terrorism. And this is what they did last February when there was a suicide attacker, a young Kashmiri boy, blew himself up against an Indian military convoy. And India blamed Pakistan for it and then bombed us. So we fear that this will happen again, because what they are doing in Kashmir will lead to a reaction, some sort of a reaction, and they will then blame Pakistan for it to divert the world's attention from this genocide in Kashmir.
Prime Minister Khan, you're speaking about Kashmir being a flashpoint. Of course, that raises concerns about potential use of nuclear weapons, either in Pakistan or in India. Now, recently, you made remarks saying, or at least the remarks were interpreted as you saying, that Pakistan would never use nuclear weapons first in any potential future conflict with India. But then a few days later, Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs clarified that there had been no change to Pakistan's nuclear defensive posture. So there is some confusion now. What exactly is Pakistan's stance? And is there a scenario by which you could envision nuclear weapons being used first by Pakistan as a defensive posture?
There is no confusion. What I said was that Pakistan would never start a war. And I'm clear. I'm a pacifist. I'm anti-war. But what I said clearly was that when two nuclear-armed countries fight, if they fight a conventional war, there is every possibility that it's going to end up into nuclear war. The unthinkable. I mean, if say Pakistan, God forbid, we're fighting a conventional war, we're losing. And if a country is stuck between the choice, either you surrender or you fight till death for your freedom. I know Pakistanis will fight to death for their freedom. So when a nuclear armed country fights to the end, to the death, it has consequences. So that's why we have approached the United Nations, we are approaching every international forum that they must act right now, because this is a potential a disaster which would go way beyond the Indian subcontinent.
Where do you stand now when it comes to potentially seeking dialogue with India? Because at first you had said you were open to it, you had made overtures. And then recently you said that's no longer the case.
From the time I assumed office, and that was last August, we have made repeated attempts to start a dialogue with India, to mend up, to live as civilized neighbors, to resolve our difference, and there is only one difference, that's Kashmir, to resolve it through a political settlement. And that why trade was important between Pakistan and India. Both countries suffer from poverty. Both countries suffer from a huge impending disaster of climate change. Both of us have similar problems. So I approached them that we should, resume talks and sort out our differences. And we repeatedly tried that. All the time when we were trying to start a dialogue and ask for talks, now I realize that this was misinterpreted. This BJP extreme right-wing, racist, fascist government was treating as if we were scared of them, or they took it as appeasement. We were trying to please them. And as a result, we discovered that while we were trying to have dialogue, they were trying to push us in the blacklist and FATF. If we are on the grey list, if Pakistan is pushed into the blacklist of FATF, that means there will be sanctions on Pakistan. So they were trying to bankrupt us economically. That's when we pulled back, and that's when we realized that this government is on an agenda. The agenda is to push Pakistan to disaster. So there's no question of talking to the Indian government right now after they revoked this Article 370 of their own constitution, and they annexed Kashmir illegally against the United Nations Security Council resolution, which had guaranteed the people that they would be able to hold a referendum and plebiscite to decide their destiny. So they have unilaterally not only broken international laws, but also their own constitution. So there's no question of talking to India in these circumstances.
So if downgrading of diplomatic ties hasn't changed India's stance toward Kashmir, and if cutting off trade ties with India hasn't changed their stance, and if there's no longer a prospect of dialogue, what else can Pakistan do?
Absolutely. There's not much more we can do except approach all the international organizations that were set up after the Second World War, mainly the United Nations. So we are hoping that appealing to these institutions and the stronger countries in the world, the superpower, the US, China is supportive, Russia, European countries, we are approaching all of them. That this flashpoint, what is Kashmir, if they do not resolve it, this has potential of having an impact on the entire world. And unfortunately, because of this whole thing about big markets, countries look at markets and trade and employment in their own countries, they look upon India as a market of 1 billion people. They do not realize that if they do not intervene right now, this has consequences, not just, as I said, on the subcontinent, on world trade. Everyone will be affected by this.
You mentioned the US. You talked about countries potentially intervening in this crisis. Now, when you were in the United States in July and you met with President Trump, he had made a public offer to try to mediate in the dispute over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. You were open to that. Prime Minister Modi was not. Do you think that this is something that could happen? Because just in the last few days, President Trump has said again that he would be willing to mediate. Do you believe this can happen?
You see, first of all, we are thankful to President Trump because, he's the president of the most powerful country in the world. And if the United States, the president of the United States intervenes in this and seriously intervenes, it's one way that you can guarantee that there will be some sort of resolution. Secondly, even if he doesn't intervene directly, the United States has this power in the United Nations Security Council. That can, as a Security Council, the UN can act. You see, why I think India is stonewalling this suggestion? Because India knows that once the international community gets involved, then the ruling will be for the people of Kashmir. The international community will insist on the people of Kashmir exercising their right of self-determination.
I'd like to focus on another component of your meeting with President Trump for just a minute, because when you were there, much of your meeting time was taken up with the issue of Afghanistan. Now, I want to ask, what do you make of President Trump basically calling off the peace talks with the Taliban, and how do you believe that's going to impact the security situation for Pakistan?
Well, first let's just concentrate on Afghanistan. Purely from a human point of view, everyone must want to help the Afghans get peace. So therefore, Pakistan is playing its part. Whatever little influence we have on the Taliban, we have asked them to go on the dialogue table. They've already, the talks with the Americans actually were at a pretty advanced state. The only thing was now to get the Taliban to talk to the Afghan government so that they can all get together and decide what they want to do. Now, this is unfortunate what has happened. I think it's because of the bloodshed that is going on in Afghanistan. The idea that there is talks, dialogue, and at the same time you're fighting, that always was going to be tricky. So I hope that this is a temporary thing. I hope that President Trump will get the talks going again, because there is no other solution. There is not going to be a military solution. If there was in 19 years, there would have been one. This is already the longest war fought by the Americans. So the only way out is getting back on the dialogue table.
All right, we've spoken a lot about the security situation. I want to turn for a bit to the economy. How would you classify Pakistan's economy? Many people say that it's failing. Many of your critics blame you, including former Finance Minister Ishaq Dar. He blames you for the current economic crisis. What do you say to that and to the other critics who are blaming you for how bad the economy is right now?
Pakistan inherited the worst economy ever in our history. We had the biggest current account deficit, which in our history no other government has had to face. That meant that the rupee, the moment we took over, because there was a shortage of dollar, because we were selling much less than we were buying from the world, that meant there was a pressure on our rupee. And so the rupee devalued. When the rupee devalues, there has to be inflation, because everything you import, fuel affects electricity, because 40% of electricity is from imported fuel. Then gas we import, LNG, that everything gets expensive. So a country goes through a difficult period. But the problem is we inherited this huge deficit. But the good news is that we have brought down the current account deficit by 70%. Our exports are going up, we've curtailed our imports, so the gap has narrowed in our current account deficit, which means we're going in the right direction.
Political leaders around the world, they get branded with nicknames. Now, surely you must be aware that there are critics of yours and others in Pakistan who call you the Prime Minister of U-turns. And they do so because they say you make U-turns on policy promises. And one such issue they talk about when they mention this is they talk about your stance on the IMF. And they say that before you had promised not to seek out any more help from the IMF, and that now your economic plan is based on a bailout. And if this would be approved, this would be the 13th time in the last 30 years Pakistan has received an assistance package from the IMF. What's different this time? I mean, why?
Let me just say one thing. I'm glad they say I am a Prime Minister of U-turns. Only an idiot doesn't do any U-turns. Only a moron, when he's on a course and he comes across as a brick wall, only that stupid idiot keeps banging his head against a brick wall. An intelligent person immediately revises his strategy and goes around it.
So you're okay with the nickname?
When I was a cricketer, we would have a strategy when we would go on the field, but all the time I would be changing my strategy according to the situation. I mean, only a fool would brand someone not doing U-turns. If these corrupt elite in our country, if they had done a U-turn from corruption, they wouldn't be in jails right now. Anyway, let me come back to the main point. IMF, when we got office, we had, we did a $6 billion deal with the IMF. We had $90.5 billion current account deficit. So how were we going to fill in this gap? Unless and until we had a loan in between, and in that time, we raised our exports, we cut down our exports. So until that time, which there was going to be a time lag, how were we going to last from that period to the time when we had curtailed the deficit? So you needed a bridging gap. We needed a bridging loan. So, they should judge me, inshallah, when my 5 years are complete. Then they should ask me, when I am responsible for my economy, am I going to rely on loans or not? And inshallah, this will be the last IMF package we will ever have.
But as far as now, today, does this mean, talking about the U-turn in this policy, does this mean that you are recognizing that it is necessary for Pakistan's financial stability and for the economy that you must ask for external support?
No, I do not believe if a country manages its economy properly, it should not have to borrow money from IMF or anyone. The fact that you have a big deficit, you have to go and borrow money, means that you're not running your economy properly. But when you inherit a sick economy, then I'm afraid in this short time, before you can raise your income to bridge this gap, I'm afraid you have to take loans. So what I'm pledging to my people that inshallah, when our term is completed, we will leave a surplus economy.
But does that mean that the IMF could exercise more control over Pakistan's decision making?
Well, they haven't exercised any control right now, apart from telling us to, put our house in order in terms of cutting down our expenditure and raising our revenues. They haven't really asked us to do anything which is against our sovereignty.
You have a very important relationship with China. If we're talking about the economy, Pakistan is the beneficiary of Chinese aid and investment. It's part of the Global Belt and Road Initiative. But the Chinese government has been fiercely criticized by especially Western countries for its reported treatment of Uyghur Muslims. Have you had a chance to formally discuss this issue with President Xi of China?
No, I haven't, and frankly, we have been facing so many of our internal problems right now that, I don't know much about this problem. And let's face it, ever since we've been in power for 1 year, domestically, apart from the economy, apart from dealing with now the situation in Kashmir, really we've been inundated with problems. But I will say one thing about China. For us, China has been the best friend.
Prime Minister Khan, you have been criticized these past few months for not issuing any statements of condemnation when it comes to China's reported treatment of the Uyghur community. Do you have any stance on the issue?
Well, I again repeat, I'm at the moment, my responsibility are people of Pakistan. I have 20 million Pakistanis I am responsible to. They are my responsibility, and therefore my number one effort is to help my own countrymen.
There is an ex-parliamentarian from your party, Baldev Kumar. He has said that he is trying to seek asylum in India, and he has argued that there are minority groups that are being persecuted in Pakistan. He has also said that the old Pakistan is better than your new Pakistan. What do you say to that?
If I remember right, this is a guy who's responsible for assassinating one of our most loved member of our party, member of parliament, Sawaran Singh. He was in our KP assembly, and this man was responsible for assassinating him. I don't know where he is right now, but last I know he was in jail. And for him to say a thing like that, let me just make it clear. ever since my government has come into power, this one government has pledged that every Pakistani, regardless of his religion, will be an equal citizen of this country. Our government has opened up the Kartarpur corridor, made great efforts for the Sikh community in opening up the religious sites. We are going to do up all the religious sites of all different religions, like Hindus, the Sikh religion, the Christian community. My government will be protecting all of them. And I'll just say one other thing. You know, if minorities are mistreated in Pakistan, that's against our constitution, it's against our religion, it's against the principles of our holy prophet, peace be upon him, because minorities were always regarded as equal citizens in Islam. So when we are unjust to them, we go against our ideology and religion. The difference between us and what the RSS-backed BJP government is doing in India, that when they mistreat minorities, it is according to their ideology. They do not believe that minorities are equal citizens. That's the big difference.
Sir, you've also faced criticism by civil rights activists saying that the space for dissent, for freedom of expression has shrunk since you took office. There are journalists in Pakistan who said that there has been a crackdown against the media, that even television stations have been taken off the air. What do you say to those criticisms?
This is utter and utter nonsense. Pakistan is one of the freest places in the world in media. You know, the members of the media have said things against me, against my government, they would never get away in any other democracy. They have personal attacks against me. Had this been any other, even any other democracy, the TV channels would have closed down. The freedom that journalists have in this country is unprecedented. This is one of the most tolerant governments ever. Although we think we've gone overboard, we think we will strengthen our regulatory body, that fake news on that basis, allegations should be made against the government, against the ministers, against anyone. So we are thinking of tightening the regulations. I think people can get away with anything they say.
All right, you've been in office now almost a year. Many of your critics say that you have not delivered on a new Pakistan, but I want to ask you, do you believe we are now in a new Pakistan, and what should the Pakistani people expect going forward?
I think we are already in New Pakistan. New Pakistan means, number one, rule of law. Never have mega criminals ever been put into jail like they have right now. The big difference in this Pakistan is government has been, well, we've been in government for 13 months. There's not one corruption case against any minister, any prime minister. This is unheard of. None of us are building up our business empires. We have conflict of interest. None of us have got businesses going as was the case in the past. But most importantly, this government is devolving power right down. We have a local government system which will liberate the people from below, which is just coming into effect right now. And, you know, the difference between now and then is that first time we're actually taking the most difficult decisions to fix our economy. Our power sector, we have cut down. You see, the problem was before that we had this huge debt accumulating in the power sector, because apart from the fact that the generation of electricity was more expensive than what it was being sold to the people, there was massive theft of electricity, and that theft was passed on to the consumer. We have cracked down on theft and really brought down the amount of what is called line losses. So this government has done things which no government has done before. But, you know, as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. When you start making these massive changes and reforms, it takes time. The time to judge a government is after 5 years. But in our case, we feel that from now on, the most difficult period which we've passed through, the first year was the most difficult period. But from now onwards, people will start seeing the difference. Already we have cut down the losses in our airline. We are about to start in the next 4 months, the steel big government corporations closed, that will start functioning. As I said, in electricity, the power theft